It's worth understanding that the role of a Linux administrator has fundamental differences to the administrator role within a Windows environment. We'll go there now. This is primarily because you need to understand that Linux is an open operating system. So it's an open source system, and administrators here are expected to go deeper and master the system at a much greater coding level than with a closed system such as Windows. The analogy here would be like a mechanic. A mechanic of a mass-produced car like a Mercedes is working with a system that is under warranty. The engineer working at that standard Mercedes service center will generally plug the car into a computer and do a diagnostic check. They might replace parts that need replacing, but they won't ever think of redesigning the engine components themselves. They're not allowed to have that level of access to the system. This is essentially what administration of a closed system looks like. So if you're an administrator of Windows or Apple, that's how it feels. You log into an interface. It's probably GUI driven. That interface only allows the administrators to enter at a certain level of entry into the code of the system. The rest is locked off and made tamper-proof by the manufacturer. And this is because Microsoft and Apple don't want you to be playing around with or even having sight of the core or the kernel of the operating system. It's their system and it's got intellectual property rights attached to it. It's a proprietary system. On the other hand, Linux is not a closed proprietary system, it's driven by a community who effectively drive the evolution of that system. And they are thankful for people looking inside, adjusting it, tweaking it, and making it better, and they will then disseminate that improvement to the rest of the community. As an administrator of a Linux system, that's much more like being a mechanic of an F1 racing team. You don't just see the source code at the DNA level, you could earn great kudos by tweaking it and making it better for the community. Windows administrators, after a certain level of investigation, will simply pick up the support line phone to Microsoft. Linux administrators will have to do it themselves or rummage around in the community and chat to people there to sort out the problems for themselves. So how does that manifest itself in terms of the differences within these two types of administrator? Well, if we look at Linux administration, of course they are obsessed with the Linux environment. They'll be keeping in touch with the community and making sure they're completely up to speed with regards all the various updates that are going on and the innovations that are brought into the Linux environment. They'll be very good at Linux scripting. They'll be adept at virtualization techniques with tools such as Zen Suite. They too, being an administrator, will be very into the configuration management tools such as Chef. Check out the platform for more details on what Chef does. They'll have a complete knowledge of Linux-based security tools and testing techniques. They'll be used to administering the environment much closer to the hardware itself. They'll be monitoring the state of the CPU and the input-output times for various applications, so they can deal with at a much more core, bare metal level. If you think about the makeup of Unix, well, this is a good diagram to show you the conceptual model of how Unix is made up. If you think about the hardware which it sits on, well, that's the core right at the middle. Then there is this thing called the kernel of the system, and you'll see that a lot on CVs. The kernel is the piece of software that interacts directly with the physical hardware, and it carries out all the processes that you need to carry out directly with the motherboard. So it handles things like direct memory and file management. Most administrators won't want to interact with the kernel on a day-to-day basis, but Linux will allow you to interact with the kernel if you need to. Usually, most administrators will be dealing with their day-to-day duties through the shell of the system. And the shell is effectively a utility or a more friendly interface that makes it easy for an administrator to make requests of the hardware when they're tweaking it. There are languages which are specific to playing around with the shell environment, and you'll see this on CVs. These are languages such as Bourne or C shell. And your client will stipulate that they need candidates who've had experience programming in Bourne or C shell or something similar. So what is shell scripting? This is how an administrator actually speaks to the hardware directly, and generally, as I mentioned earlier, they will go through the shell. And scripting through the shell is setting up small, repeatable programs using languages like Bourne, believe it or not, Bourne Again, or Bash, POSIX, and Tenix. Very often you'll see the term Korn as well. So whenever you see terms like Korn scripting or Bourne scripting, think about it as an administration programming environment. Administrators write shell scripts so they don't need to rewrite a commonly required procedure or a routine each time. I've explained the automation and scripting side of things in other areas of systems administration. Go back to the systems admin module and take a look at that. But when you're doing it at a really deep motherboard level, this is known as shell scripting. So what do these small scripts do? Well, they can carry out patches to existing software. They can carry out processes for user or group management, such as creating or freezing or deleting accounts. They can carry out regular security sweeps for viruses and any other irregularities within the system, and they can do those on a regular basis. And they can generally look at the hardware, including things like disks, looking out for poor performance or poorly used disk space. If you've understood everything I've just said, it must become apparent to you now that there is a key difference between a Linux administrator and a Windows administrator, primarily from the basis of them being able to access different levels of code within the system. Linux has full access to the source code, and this means that administrators can tweak at the kernel level. This usually means faster bug fixing and really the ability to build in better security and other protocols that you might need to. In actual fact, if an administrator is good enough within the Linux environment, well, they can upgrade and supercharge their Linux operating system as much as they actually want. No one's going to put any limits to the innovations that they put into there. On the other hand, with Windows, the kernel is locked. Now this means that the main engine issues of the network are guaranteed by the vendor. So you have to go back to them, and if things do go wrong at a really deep level, you can blame Microsoft, you can go back to them and hold them to account. With Linux, you are generally supported by the community. There are, of course, commercial versions of Linux, such as Red Hat, and this is geared towards actually providing a good level of commercial support to Linux administrators. Windows, of course, you are fully supported by the Microsoft help desk. Let's think about what it means in terms of hardware and peripheral innovations. Well, as hardware evolves and peripherals change, this could be a bit touch and go when you're in the Linux environment, because suddenly you are having to look out for new drivers and find them yourselves. Of course, with Windows, changes in the hardware are a big deal and they are mainstream, and so generally it is built into any new operating system and it's much more plug and play. With Linux, the roots of Linux are in command line. It's not very user-friendly, but the administrators love the idea of a very deep, granular level ability to adjust. With Windows, the administrator sees quite a nice GUI interface, and you and I could pick up a lot of what they're doing after a bit of practice. What this means is that Linux has, in essence, much greater flexibility and creativity. So it's great for people who want to tinker with the system and explore the limits of their own knowledge and the system itself. Whereas something like Windows, it's set to be a bit more rigid. Of course, it's great for a nice structural approach to your system where you need a good help desk to help you through, and you just need that system to run well. So I think the takeaway here is that if you want to get creative and create your own powerful, unique, bespoke system to run your environment, then Linux might be the way to go, in which case you would need a very techie administrator. However, if you just simply want your system to run smoothly and you're not too worried about adjusting it at a core, critically deep level, well, don't worry, go with Windows. Most business models do not need supercharged operating systems. They just want a very good sound commercial setup so that there is accountability at every level if things go wrong, which usually implies that a Windows administrator might be thought of as less technical than a Linux administrator. The rule of thumb also seems to be that in that case, the Linux administrators tend to be paid a bit more. There's much more to this from a technical perspective, and they both have their upsides and their downsides, but I wanted to give you a good overview and a brisk walk through the differences between these two roles. I hope that's helped.